You are getting ready for the big road trip. You get the kids all in the car, and before you leave, you say, okay, does anybody have to go to the bathroom? They all say, no, we're fine. So you start driving, you stop to get gas, and before you leave, you say, okay, we're about to get on the thruway. This is your last chance. Does anybody have to go to the bathroom? No, we're fine. So you get on the thruway, and just when you pass that sign that says next exit in 45 miles, you hear from the back seat, Mommy, I have to go to the bathroom. We've all been there. We've been the parents, or we've been the youth leader, or we've been the kid. We have the propensity for the worst timing ever. And we've all been there when others have done that to us too. When a friend maybe has made us a big promise and they let us down at the worst possible time. Or when the boss decides that they're going to have a bad day on the worst possible day. We've all been victims of bad timing. But it's not the worst when it's our friends or family or children who have bad timing. No, the hardest feeling for us is when it seems like God has bad timing. After all, God is sovereign, isn't He? We're good Presbyterians. We believe God knows everything and has planned everything. So why is it that His plans seem like they're so poorly timed sometimes? Why is it that the health crisis seems to strike when everybody else is already having a health crisis? Why is it, God, that you're letting this car accident happen when my finances are already under strain? Why is it that my husband chose today to blow up at the kids when I already had a horrible day at work? Not only is that really hard for us, but it often makes it hard to believe that we have a good God who really knows and who really cares. Because if God was powerful enough, He would have stopped something like that from happening. Or if He cared enough, He would have intervened. So if His timing was this bad, He must not be strong enough, or He must not care. If not, then why is God's timing so bad sometimes? Maybe you're asking some of those questions this morning as you face a poorly timed health crisis, or a broken relationship, or a financial strain at the worst possible time. Why is God doing this now? That's the same question the Israelites might have been asking a few thousand years ago. Because where we open up today in the book of Joshua, we'll be looking at Joshua chapters 3 through 5. Joshua commands the Israelites to do some pretty absurd things. These commands, which were initiated by God, would not have been so bad if they weren't timed the way they were. But the timing of the commands made them impossible to carry out. Why would God do this now, of all times? If He'd done it differently, it could have been much easier. Why now, the Israelites probably wondered. But we find our answer in between the two stories. In between the two hard places is a story about 12 rocks. And in that lesson, we might just discover a little bit of why God has the timing that He does. Often in biblical narratives, the point of a lesson is sandwiched between two parallel stories. The literary term is a chiasm, but sandwich is a lot easier to remember. So sandwiched between these two hard places are 12 rocks. What do they mean? What did they tell the Israelites? And what might they tell us today about God's bad timing? That's where we'll open up today in Joshua chapter 4, verses 18 through 24, which will be on the screen behind me. Just a bit of background before we read from that passage. We ended last week at the end of Joshua chapter 2. The Israelite spies had gone into Jericho. They'd gone back after meeting with Rahab and gave Joshua the report, God has surely given us the land. And in chapter 3, they act on that promise. They cross the Jordan River, which God miraculously separates just like He parted the Red Sea in the book of Exodus. And in Joshua chapter 4, we pick up right after Israel miraculously crosses the Jordan into the promised land. Beginning in verse 18. And the priests came up out of the river, carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. No sooner had they set their feet on the dry ground than the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and ran at flood stage as before. On the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from the Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, "In the future, when your descendants ask their fathers, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them, 'Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground.' For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan just as he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God." I think the key to our story is found in that final verse, in verse 24, where Joshua says, God did this so that the peoples of the earth might know the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. There's two reasons God did what he did. And I think that gives us the lesson of Joshua 3-5. That God works in unexpected ways to show us his power and to help us to trust him. God works in unexpected ways to show us his power and help us to trust him. We'll first look at that first idea. God shows us his power, which we see in the crossing of the Jordan from Joshua chapter 3. The crossing of the Jordan was a really big deal. See, crossing the Jordan River, as we see in Numbers chapter 35, meant that Israel was officially entering the land that had been promised to Abraham 600 years ago. If you've been with us the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about how one of the main ideas of the book of Joshua is that God is faithful to fulfill those promises to Abraham, and that his people are supposed to be obedient. In Joshua 3, when the people are getting ready to cross over the Jordan River, that means one of those three promises to Abraham is about to be fulfilled. The promise of a land, a nation, and a leader. When Israel crosses past the Jordan River, that means the promise of the land is finally starting to be fulfilled. A 600-year-old promise. But not only that, we see in verse 7 of chapter 3 that there's another promise being fulfilled. The promise of a leader. Because God says to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in front of all Israel, so that they may know that I am with you, as I was with Moses." One of the other promises that God had made to Abraham was that his descendants would be leaders, that they would bring all the nations back to God. And here God promises to Joshua, through this miraculous event, I'm going to raise you up a powerful leader just like Moses. What a big day in Israel's history. They're about to fulfill a 600-year-old promise. Joshua is having his coming out party as a leader. So they get to the banks of the Jordan and they find a really small, unimpressive river. I mean, I've been to Israel. The Jordan's not that big. It's not so miraculous to cross it when you could just jump over the banks, right? Come on, God, the Red Sea, the Jordan River, not so impressive. Until we read chapter 3, verse 15, which tells us that during the harvest time, the Jordan runs at flood stage. At harvest, a big mountain north of the Jordan, Mount Hermon, over 9,000 feet tall, a little bit bigger than some of the mountains we have here in New York. During the spring, the snow begins to melt, and all that snow pours into the Jordan River, which makes it go from that little trickle to looking a bit more like this. Suddenly, bringing a few 100,000 men, women, and children, including elderly and livestock and babies, across a mighty flowing river at flood stage, suddenly that gets a little bit harder, doesn't it? You can imagine the people of Israel looking at the Jordan and being like, really, God? Any other time, this would have been easy. I'd be up to my knees. But now, you want us to cross the Jordan River now, during the 1 month that it's impossible to do. Thanks a lot. But we've experienced that at certain points in our lives, haven't we? God, I could have followed you in faith. I could have done what you wanted me to do, but you're asking me to do something really hard when my home life is a wreck. Or God, I really want to become involved in a church community, or I really want to step up in service, but you're asking me to do it right when you decided that my health had to go and fall apart. Really, God? Now? Why are you doing this now? Why are you asking me to trust you now? Why are you leading me into this hard time now? And why do you want me to act in faith now? The summer after my freshman year of college, I was a camp counselor at Scioto Hills Christian Camp in southern Ohio. And I felt pretty confident that I would be a good camp counselor, because up to this point, I had had a lot of good ministry experience for my age. After all, that year I had been the freshman class chaplain at Cedarville, so I had preached to thousands of people. I had been ordained the youngest deacon in my church's history. Camp counseling, I've been leading vacation Bible school games since I was born. I've got that covered. It was a disaster. Don't get me wrong, I love, don't take offense, Dolan boys, I love teenagers, but living in a cabin with 12 middle schoolers who all moved to me my first night was a little overwhelming. It was a really, really challenging week, because I'd been so good at all the ministry things so far, but I wasn't as good at communicating to the teenagers. I wasn't as good and as exciting as the other counselors. I looked at others and thought, oh, I'm not as good as them. And for the first time, I had run into a ministry situation where my gifts weren't getting the job done. And then, at the end of the week, I lost my voice. Now, there are not many worse times to lose your voice than being a camp counselor, because your job is to be loud. You're supposed to yell, be excited, be dancing, be chastising your kids when they're poking a hornet nest with a stick. You need your voice. And I remember calling out to God saying, really? Now? Now is when you want me to lose my voice. My voice is what I rely on. My voice is literally my job right now. You want me to lose my voice now. But during that week, I also discovered something really surprising. See, throughout those weeks, our song as counselors, our refrain, was the song, Lord, I Need You. It goes, Lord, I need you, oh, I need you, every hour I need you, my one defense, my righteousness, God, how I need you. It was a song, much like our call to worship psalm this morning, that passionately cries out to God and says, I need your help. I can't do it on my own. And for one of the first times in my life, I found myself at that point realizing, oh, I can't do it on my own. But in that week, instead of finding myself weak, incapable, and powerless, I found myself suddenly able to do far much more than I expected. Suddenly I started to have breakthroughs with my kids. Suddenly things started to go well, because I was relying on the one who's the true source of our power. God puts us into situations where we need to depend on Him. He asks us to follow Him at hard times so that we'll learn to lean on the source of our power. That's the lesson He had for Israel. John MacArthur has a good quote along these lines. MacArthur also had a really unfortunate quote in the past couple of weeks that was really disparaging towards women in ministry. So I don't condone everything MacArthur says. But you can be really, really wrong about some things and be really, really right about others. That's a broken clock is right twice a day idiom, right? So on this note, MacArthur is really right when he makes the point that when programs, methods, and money produce impressive results, there's the inclination to confuse human success with divine blessing. In other words, when we do a good job and things go well, it's easy to think, we got this and God gave us the thumbs up. Right? We're the ones getting the job done. But MacArthur says that when that happens, passionate longing for God and yearning for his help will be missing, along with his empowerment. In other words, when we cease to recognize God as the source of our power, not only do we lose our relationship with him, but we actually lose some of our capability. Because when we're leaning on him, not only do we grow in love for him, but we're actually able to do far more. It's not saying just be passive, let God do all the work, and you're fine, you don't have to do anything, let go and let God. It's more, as J.I. Packer would say, trust God and get going. Take the step of faith. It took a lot of faith to walk into the Jordan River with the waters piled up 20 miles away and say, hope that doesn't come down anytime soon. But at the same time, the people of Israel realized God was the one at work. That's why we see in verse 18, God sends the Ark of the Covenant into the waters. As soon as the priests come up out of the waters with the Ark of the Covenant, the waters go back to flood stage. Why the Ark of the Covenant? What is the Ark of the Covenant? It's not some magical totem as Indiana Jones might lead us to believe, but there's something God is trying to communicate here. See, the Ark of the Covenant, we learn in the book of Exodus, was the housing for the 10 Commandments and a couple of other miraculous items from the time of the giving of the law. But the Ark of the Covenant also, we learn in Exodus chapter 25, was the place where God met with Moses. There, he said, above the cover between the two cherubim that are above the cover of the Ark of the Covenant law, there I will meet with you. We see throughout the Old Testament, the Ark of the Covenant is where God manifests his physical presence with Israel. So when the Ark of the Covenant goes into the Jordan River, it's as if God himself is stepping into the water and holding it up for them. They couldn't have a clearer mental image. He didn't need the ark to do it. He could have done it without the ark. But he sent the ark in so that there would be no doubt that Israel would see it is God, by his power, who's making us able to follow him. And isn't that really the story of the gospel? Jesus stepping into the path of the water, taking it for us so that we can walk through the sea that he split after him. Not that we're passive, but that we realize he's the one who makes the way so we can follow in faith. After this first development, that God shows his power, we see a strange ritual. Joshua sets up a pile of 12 rocks at Gilgal. We don't usually set up rock piles unless we're making a fire pit. We're really bored today. So what's the point of a rock pile in ancient Israel? Well, they actually were very significant. We see in Genesis 35 that Jacob set up a stone pillar at the place where he had talked with God. Also where he had wrestled with God. A stone monument marked where God showed up. We see the same thing in 1 Samuel chapter 7. When God miraculously routs the Philistines before Israel, and Samuel sets up a stone between Mizpah and Shen, he names it Ebenezer, saying, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." Again, a stone monument represents a mighty intervention of God. But why does Samuel name it after Ebenezer Scrooge from the Christmas story? Well, Ebenezer actually is two Hebrew words combined into a compound word. The word Eben is stone. The word Ezer means help. So an Ebenezer is a stone of help. A stone monument that reminds Israel of God's help and intervention for them. So when we sing the old hymn, "Come Thou Fount," and the writer says, "Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come," what he's really saying is, here I raise my stone of help to remind me that it's by your help I've gotten to this point. We don't build stone monuments really today, but we do have moments we might call stones of help in our lives, don't we? Times where God has moved in a mighty way, where he's shown us his power, where he's delivered us when we least expected it. Times that we can look back on and remember, oh, that's right. He is powerful. He does care. Perhaps times when God has delivered you from a crisis of health. Perhaps the time that he led you to faith in him when you wanted nothing to do with him. Perhaps when you lost your voice at a camp. What might a stone of help be for you? A time when you can look back and remember God mightily moving in your life to show you he cares for you and that he's powerful enough to take on whatever you face. Because the stone of help is not just meant to be a memory. It's meant to be a motivation. And that's what we see in the second part of this 3-chapter story. When we turn to chapter 5, because God has another crazy command up his sleeve. In chapter 5, verse 2, whoops, there's my main point, just in case you forgot that. God works in unexpected ways to show us his power. The second part, to help us to trust him. That's what we see in chapter 5, verse 2, when God says to Joshua to make flint knives and circumcise all the Israelites. Now, I don't need to go on a dissertation about circumcision here for you to conclude that circumcising your entire army is not usually an effective military strategy. That's not the thing you do right after you cross into enemy territory. Remember, they're across the Jordan River now. They don't have a border blocking them from the enemy nations. It's like God said, all right, go and camp against your enemy nations, and now let's incapacitate your entire army. That's not a good battle plan, God. What are you doing? What a terrible military strategy. We know why. God tells us why he commands it, because he's being faithful to fulfill the promises to Israel. We see in verses 4 through 8, this is why he did so. The people who had come out of Egypt had been circumcised, but all the people born in the desert had not. So after the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were. That word nation should ring a bell, because it's the other promise to Abraham God had made. I'll make you into a great nation. And in Genesis 17, God had told Abraham that the mark of his covenant, the mark of his promise with Abraham, was that his descendants would be circumcised. So circumcision is essentially the mark that Israel is God's nation. It's the mark that God is being faithful to fulfill his promises. It's a mark of true trust in God and the re-establishment of Israel's fellowship with God. But it's at the worst time possible. Why couldn't you have done this on the other side of the Jordan, God? Why'd you wait till we got across? Really? Now? But Joshua also, on hearing that command, would have been able to turn around and see a pile of rocks and remember, God's done it before. He can do it again. And if he's commanded me to act in faith now, I can trust he will deliver me again. That's what we see as the second big idea here, that the pile of rocks was to be a reminder for Israel to always fear their God. Now to us, fear seems kind of strange. That's a bad motivator for obedience. You don't want to obey somebody out of fear. But fear biblically is a little different than the intimidation fear that we understand it to mean. Fear biblically had to do with a reverential awe towards God, a respect of who he is. And when knowing who he really is, that would motivate his people to follow him in obedience. That's what we see in the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. When the Israelites saw the hand of the Lord against the Egyptians, they feared the Lord. Now, God had just protected Israel. He delivered them. Why would they be afraid of him? He had just helped them cross the Red Sea and defeated the Egyptian army. They had nothing to be afraid of. But as the current culture icon in the Office series, very popular with my generation, Michael Scott would say, is it better to be feared or loved? I would say both. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me. God would say it a little differently. I want my people to be afraid of how much I love them. I want them to know that I love them so much that they will respect me, respect my commands, and walk in my ways. And when they realize God's love for them and they fear his power, that will motivate them to obedience. That's what we see in the book of Proverbs, that the fear of the Lord was a motivator for following God. It's the beginning of wisdom. The fear of God leads to changed behavior. I have a good friend of mine back in Rhode Island who's a father of 5 kids. He's a great father. He's a loving father and his kids adore him. But if the mom needs to get the kids to obey, all she needs to say is, just you wait till your father gets home. And when he walks back in the door, he knows something went wrong because the kids come running up to him. Hi, Daddy! They love their dad and they know he loves them, but they also respect him and know that he knows what's right and that there are consequences for not doing what's right. The fear of the Lord we see here in the book of Joshua is a fear that inspires Israel to act in obedience. The fear that when they see the rocks, they'll remember what God did at the Jordan, and that will motivate them to obey another one of God's crazy commands. And indeed, when we see Israel obey, we see at the very end of our section here, verses 11 and 12, that very day they ate from the produce of the land. The manna stopped. Manna, as some of you will know, is the bread from heaven God had provided for the Israelite people while they were wandering in the desert. He provided for them to the very moment they needed. And after they act in faith, he gives them a new provision. Now, this isn't to say that just because God has moved in one way before, he'll definitely do it again. God won't deliver us from every health crisis because eventually we all will die. God won't necessarily move in a financial crisis in the same exact way as he once did. The point of the stone of help isn't to say God will do just what you want if you have enough faith. It's to remind us God has moved before. He can move again. And if he doesn't, it's not because he doesn't care. It's not because he can't do it. It's because he does know what's best. So as we look back to our stones of help, and we look towards our future, are we motivated to believe God can do it again? I mean, God miraculously moved in Corinth one time when we needed $35,000 to get out of the Peace USA and go into ECO, and we got a $36,000 memorial donation. But when another financial crisis comes up, it might be hard to believe that he could do it again. But he can, can't he? We're not alone in our doubts. I mean, the disciples watched Jesus feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. 2 weeks later, there were 4,000 people gathered. And they said to themselves, how are we going to find enough food to feed this many people? Jesus is probably standing there saying, really? Like, come on, what? But we do it all the time, don't we? We've seen God move before. Stones of help remind us he can move again. So what about today? What can we take away? I think 3 ideas. 1, to recognize stones of help. To see that God is at work in all of our lives. We just need the eyes to see it. When you tell the stories of your week on social media or to your friends at the coffee shop, do you say, look at all the great things I've done, or say, look at all the good things God's given to me? When we add God talk into our language, we begin to see ways that God is moving in mighty ways. Let's recognize God is at work and give him the credit. Secondly, record stones of help. One of the reasons I could so articulate that story of me losing my voice is that's the year I became a proficient, what's profusive even mean? Proficient journaler. I began to journal all the time. And I can now have a story, a record of the stones of help of my life. You may not be a journaler or a scrapbooker type. If you are, then seek to record these moments. But maybe you can do something similar to what we're doing at the study at the Straits on Tuesday night, and keeping a prayer book. To keep records of prayers to see how God has moved, so that when a time of crisis we can remember are stones of help. When I've been here in ministry my first couple of months, there have been times where I wonder what I'm doing. Times where I've been a little overwhelmed or discouraged. But when I can look back at what God has done, through my journals, through my own stones of help, it's easier for me to see, oh, He's done it before. He can do it again. If you are facing a crazy command of God, God's poor timing, will you look back and remember a stone of help in your life? To remind you that God has worked before to show you His power and to help you to trust Him again. Amen. This time may the ushers come on forward to receive the tithes and the offerings.